Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Show is the wow, I almost introduced this as a different podcast. The GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. It is Wednesday, which means we're not talking about Endymion. Oh wait, we are. In case anyone was wondering, I love this book. I don't love the ending. We're finishing it off today. I just want to apologize in advance. I had said that there were only 5 more chapters last week. There were actually 10 for a total of 60 chapters, which is, you know, about par for the course, with these Dan Simmons books, which is, you know, I don't know if you want to call it good or bad. It just is what it is. But regardless, I'm definitely happy about it. For sure. So we are going to finish this one and then start talking about the next one probably on Sunday. Honestly, I'm thinking October is just going to be Hyperion month primarily. Just because I'm really excited to get through the last book. So hopefully we'll be able to do that. It just depends on how long it is. I haven't even taken a look at how many chapters it has. So but there's a lot that happens, a lot of things to talk about, some changes of heart, some interesting battles, some revelations, and ultimately, as usual, lots of predictions about what is going to hopefully happen next. So, yeah, I guess strap in because we're about to get started. So last week, we, I think, finished off by talking about the fact that Radamanth Nemes, who is the woman who was assigned to, what's his face, Father Captain Desoya's ship, is really evil and is probably sent by the AI core, the Techno core rather. So she's bad. Bad news bears. If she's even human. I would guess that she's probably a cybrid, but we don't really get to learn much about her, unfortunately. Hashtag spoilers. But when we last left off, she had just made planetfall on, had just set a plot or set a course for the next place that Ania was going to be traveling to, and she had decided that she was going to head her off at the next pass, if you will. And that next stop is God's Grove, which is, it's the next place that the Farcaster portal is going to be sending her. But Radamanth Nemes finds out that after God's Grove, apparently the final location is in a place that even the Technocore can't get to, which I find to be interesting because, yeah, it's a big deal that they're going there. So I'm definitely interested to see where that particular aspect of everything is going because it's just, there's a lot of mystery. We find out eventually that is Earth, as in old Earth, as in the Earth that was taken by the lions, tigers, and bears of the metasphere, and not by the Technocore like we thought it was, and not destroyed like everybody else thought it was. So it definitely still exists, and we know that because what's his face has been there. Keats has been there. So we know that because Keats has been there, and that happened in what, the second book, I want to say. Yeah, we didn't even have Keats in the first book. So yeah, in the second book, we find out that Earth exists, and that originally Umon tells Keats that the Technocore stole it, but really Umon was lying, and something else took it and saved it, if you will. So the Technocore have been trying to find it. I don't know why. There's probably something to do, like, the same with, like, the labyrinthian worlds. There's probably something to do with, like, some sort of thing that has power because it's on a planet, or I don't even know. There's a lot of, like, quasi-mysticism in this particular book that I find to be pretty dang enjoyable. I mean, I really like it. So, is what it is. But we'll get to that eventually. So Radamanth Nemes gets to God's Grove, which, if you remember from the second book, is the place where the Templar are from. So it's kind of a big deal, or it was. They had planted a bunch of, like, well, I guess they call them sequoias. I don't know if that's part of the terraforming, or if, like, those trees had just happenstantially evolved in a similar way to the ones on Earth, or what have you. I don't know. But supposedly there were just, like, tons and tons of trees on this planet. It was very arboreal, and now not so much. Radamanth Nemes gets there and sees all of the destruction that the Technocore had imparted on it. It seems like most of these planets are pretty much, like, totally abandoned, which I find to be relatively surprising. I would have thought that they would run into more people, but it seems like after Renaissance Vector and Mare Infinitus, well, okay, I guess Draconi Septum had people as well, but, like, 2 or 3 out of the 5 planets that they go to don't have people. Hebron, Kasad, that the old Muslim world, and then which is what they refer to it as in the book, just so everyone knows that I'm referring to it according to the book. And then the God's Grove. 3 of those out of the 5 that they travel to through Farcaster portals don't have people, because Draconi Septum has people and Mare Infinitum has people, but the other ones do not. I think it's interesting also that it kind of goes every other planet that they go to has people. So the first one they travel to is Mare Infinitum, people. Second one, Hebron, no people. Third one, Draconi Septum, people. Fourth one, can't remember the name of it, but there's no people there. And that point that I had been making last week about, like, the Abrahamic faiths, that gets brought up by Simmons in the chapter with Ania and Endymion and Abetic. And he mentions that there's no people on both of those planets, and those people would also have been very against Catholicism. So there's a chance that, how the ousters were faking, or the AI or the Technocore used the ousters to fake the invasion on God's Grove. I am pretty sure they did the same thing with Hebron and the other the Muslim world in this universe. So, and Ania seems to be indicating the same thing as well, which it felt very satisfying to hear. So anyway, Radamanth Nemes gets to God's Grove. She talks about all the destruction there, and then looks at the river, knows where the Farcaster portal is, because of course she does. Knows where the next Farcaster portal is, because of course she does. And decides that she's going to basically set a bunch of traps in order to catch Endymion, Ania, and Abetic off guard. And not just catch them off guard, but like brutally murder. Simmons goes into detail about some of the things that she uses as traps. The first one is, apparently it's called microfilament. It's like if you could make fishing line even thinner and then make it so sharp that if you even touch it, it'll cut your arm off, then that's what it is. And she spreads that out across like an entire section of river, which is not great, that's for sure. And that in itself is bad enough. But then she finds the only bank that they could likely crawl up onto and covers it with these claymores, is what she calls them, but they're like claymores on crack. They have the ability to like jump onto the person, or jump onto people, and then they blow up like facing in towards you. So it's basically just like an anti-personnel charge, like hardcore though, because it would basically like jump onto your body and then blow up, and so it would just blow all of your insides inside. So it's just not great. So that's one of the options for death. That's the second option for death. The third option is called like an earwig trap, which are a bunch of little robots that when you step on them, they're like little robot eggs, and they're pre-programmed so that it like the egg cracks, and then all of these tiny little robots jump or go straight into your heel, I think it is, or like they blow up in like a big old cloud, and then they drill into your head and explode into like balls of razor wire. So yeah, it's gruesome. And that is option number 4 or 3 for dying. And then of course, we have mentioned that she's assuming the Shrike will be there in some capacity, so she has some anti-Shrike stuff. Apparently like it's called a Sphinx trap that just creates a little pocket in time. So something is stuck in time for a set amount of time, and then it like phases back into time. I think it's like 5 minutes later or something is what she mentioned specifically. So definitely definitely kind of weird for sure. But that's, what she's apparently assuming, that she's going to have to fight the Shrike, which I thought was interesting because, we haven't really been able to figure out what it is that the Shrike is doing on this particular voyage. It's interesting that it is this like really, really heinously awful, terrifying thing of like from a horror movie in the first 2 books. And in this book, whenever it's appeared, I've just been kind of like, oh, hey, there's the Shrike. Woo, hey, buddy. Simmons does a really good job of taking you from thinking that it's like this really awful, impervious thing to like, well, one, Kasad defeats it once apparently at some point, and 2, it like hasn't really done anything in this book, so like you're not really sure exactly what its purpose is. So yeah, and the really messed up thing that Nemesis does with all these traps is that she kind of like tries to predict what it is that the people who come up against them will do. So if you make it through the microfilament, then you would go to the grassy shore. And there's this grassy shore, that's where the claymores are. Okay, but if you don't go to the grassy shore, then you would go upstream because you would want to, or because you would now not trust what is behind you because it might be trapped, or really what is in front of you, because, it would be downstream is in front of you, upstream is behind you. So if you go backwards and you're walking along the riverbed, then you would run into the earwig trap. So basically it's kind of like just really cruddy. And a really mean thing for her to do to our would-be heroes, which, obviously I don't like because I like our heroes. I also don't like Nemesis because she's, like, deliberately toying with the lives of all the people who are on board the Raphael. And, like, I like them. I've grown quite attached to Father Captain Tasoya, in fact, which is probably a good thing. Not totally sure. I mean, by the end of the book, I'm pretty sure he's going to die, but, it feels like this is the type of book where most of the people die in some regard and not necessarily in a good way. But that's neither here nor there necessarily. That's like the 3rd time I've said that in the last minute. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So Nemesis sets all these traps, and Ania, as we know from last week, is starting to feel ill and has been acting weird or oddly because she knows that Glaucus is dead, as well as the band of the Chichituk that they were traveling with. and she knows that there's something in wait for them at God's Grove, which is the next place that they're going to. So we're going to talk more about Ania and all of them right after this quick commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
I had just described Radamanth Nemesis' 5 Fun Ways to Die game that she was playing with Ania, Abetic, and Endymion. So we're going to jump over to Abetic, Endymion, and Ania now because they're important too, since Radamanth Nemesis is pretty much just after them. So Nia doesn't get any better. She's still sick. They go through the portal, and they get on God's Grove. And the way that Simmons writes it is pretty cool because if I remember correctly, we hear them getting there, and then we hear the chapter after that about the traps, and then we hear about them running into the traps. Is the way I think it goes, or it's that we hear about the traps, they leave, and then they get there. And they don't know about the traps, but we do. I think what's really interesting in part about this book is kind of like the Shakespearean way that it is constantly giving us as an audience an aside about what it is that the main characters don't know. It's kind of like it's the best way to break the fourth wall, in my opinion. And it is not the traditional way that we would think of as breaking the fourth wall, because normally when you break the fourth wall, it's like, ha ha ha, I see you, and that's the way that like a character would break the fourth wall. But in this particular instance, it's kind of more like I know that you know that there's a thing happening here that the main character doesn't know about, which is why it's breaking the fourth wall, wink wink, nudge nudge. And I think that that's a much more effective method of storytelling than the alternative, which, like I mentioned before, is kind of like the more, like, I guess Deadpool is a good example. Deadpool does it really well because that's part of the character, but otherwise, like, most movies they're trying to be ironic in their depiction of breaking the fourth wall, like, oh, look, it's so ironic that you're watching a movie. But the way that Deadpool does it is kind of like, it's ironic that we're ironically mentioning that you are being talked to directly by the main character. It's just like so many layers of irony, it becomes funny. In the same way that, like, this book, the way that Simmons writes it, it basically is like, hey, I know that you know that I know that you know. And so it's a lot of layers of just kind of like obfuscation and perception, and the fact that he's playing around with time and all this other stuff that just kind of like, it makes you feel like you are like some sort of third-person observer. And what's interesting is that the chapters written by Endymion are written by Endymion in the future, right? Or sorry, the chapters about Endymion, Ania, and Abetic are written by Endymion of the future. And we do find out some more about like his current status in the future, which is important because if you guys remember correctly, he is apparently imprisoned somewhere, and if he doesn't do something right, he'll breathe in cyanide gas and die. Or if he continues to do something, I don't know exactly, but for some reason we are, as readers, gaining access to this information. He does direct us, or he does directly address us at the end of this book, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Right now, we're not on that. So Ania and the gang make it through the portal. Obviously, there's really no one to hold them up from getting through the portal because there's nobody on the planet that they were just on. And they get to God's Grove, and things are going really well. Everyone's excited. They're enjoying themselves. As Endymion says, when they hit some light rapids, rapids have a tendency to put a smile on people's face and make them feel good because they get to work as a team. Having gone whitewater rafting myself, I can't help but agree. Rapids are kind of fun to float on, especially if they're not terribly dangerous. Of course, bad things can happen if you don't know what you're doing, but generally, if you're on a whitewater rapid tour, it's just generally fun. So, and that seems to be kind of what Endymion was most familiar with. Which is funny in its own right, in my opinion, because the number of little odd jobs that Endymion has had throughout his life, it seems like he's kind of done a little bit of everything, even though he's not that old. At least not that old in the book right now, or in the story being told right now. But things quickly go awry, as you would probably have guessed, because there's a bunch of traps that are placed on the river by a emotionless, programmed killing machine. A very efficient one at that, I will say. And so, as they're going down the river, I don't remember exactly how it is that they find the microfilament. Oh, that's right. The mast on their ship gets cut by the microfilament. And Endymion's like, everybody duck. And that is when things start to really go to crap. Endymion pushes down Ania's head, and he ducks, and Abetic also ducks, I believe. But in that act of ducking, they push the boat or something into another microfilament because the way that Nemes set it up, it was a big old web. And yeah, that's not good, obviously. So the boat hits another bit of microfilament and starts to get cut. And then Abetic ends up in the water, and he's in the water and goes to instinctively reach up to grab something, and his arm gets cut off. Yeah. So that's not good. So he's bleeding a lot. And it's interesting. Dan Simmons does this really cool thing where he describes the scene in the river from Endymion's point of view, and then from Radamanth Nemesis' point of view. And the way that Radamanth describes the scene is so casual. She says the book says Nemes watched them floundering around in the water, they're playing around in the water, because Nemes was just okay, well, they'll die. Obviously that was her goal. So, Abetic gets his arm cut off, and then Endymion is able to pull out his flashlight laser and find a lot of the cord, and so he ultimately decides that there's no way they can go back, or that they can go upriver or downstream with the current, because there's just too much microfilament there, and the flashlight laser will not cut through it, which is a bummer. If he had known it was there, he probably could have shot through it with the plasma rifle type of a thing, but unfortunately, that was not an option. So he decides that they're going to go upriver, which means they're going toward the earwig trap, but in that process, he has to find a way to get a belt over to Abetic without falling into the water and also holding on to Ania. And then they decide that they're going to try to stand up, and that's obviously difficult to do in rapids if you've ever done it. I'm not really sure which one's better. Even if the water is only waist deep, if you're standing in rapids, it's pretty difficult. So they start to go upriver, and they haven't made, or they're, heading upriver, and they're getting close to the earwig trap, and all of a sudden out of nowhere, the Shrike jumps out of the water at them and just like barely misses them. And this is like the second time the Shrike has appeared. I forgot to mention this, but when they go to get on the raft on the Muslim world, the Shrike is on the raft with them. And Ania is like trying to convince Rawl that he doesn't need to be worried because if the Shrike was going to kill them, it could have already done so a million times over. And she's not worried about the Shrike. And it is like compared to being like a hood ornament or can't remember what the thing is on a ship. But basically it's kind of talked about as being like a sculpture or something. If I had to guess, the architect that Ania wants to meet is the one who built the Shrike, and there is something to the sculpture of the Shrike, but I'm not entirely sure. So the Shrike jumps out of the water because after they go through the Farcaster portal, it's not there anymore, and yeah, the Shrike jumps out of the water, though why the Shrike would save them from the earwig trap but not just like cut down all the microfilaments is beyond me, because like obviously I don't think that they would hurt the Shrike. That's a pretty basic thing, and the Shrike is, I mean, it's got this kind of like archaic evil steam engine thing going for it, but like at the same time it just doesn't seem like that would be the thing that would cause issue for it in any way. So yeah, I don't know why it didn't cut the wires too, but whatever. So it warns them of the earwig trap, so they end up deciding to get out of the water, and they get out of the water onto a ridge, and they're trying to stabilize Abetic, and then Nemesis walks up, and she's walking down the lava rock, because there's a bunch of lava rock in this area, because it was brought up by the lancing, or the lasers that were used to like lance the planet back in the hegemony days. And there's still some remnants of like, they talk about the world tree a couple times, and the world tree is supposed to be kind of similar to the world tree in in Norwegian mythos. So it's like this huge tree that like Endymion says that like they see the stump, and he says that is too big to have ever been a tree. Though I am curious where the rest of it went. I think it burned down is kind of the deal. I'm not totally sure. I don't remember if they mentioned that specifically. But Radamanth Nemesis walks down and says, and Endymion pulls his flashlight laser on her, and she says, "Oh, you wouldn't use that on me now, would you?" And that is where Dan Simmons reverses it and tells us the story from Radamanth Nemesis's point of view. And that's when we get the kind of like, oh, I watched them floundering on the bank, and then I watched the Shrike save them from my earwig trap and all this stuff. So, yeah, she starts to walk up to them. She apparently has a specimen bag that she's going to put Ania's head in. She mentions specifically that Ania does have powers of some sort that she's unaware of, so we'll see what that means eventually. I guess I'm kind of excited about that. Not totally sure. I hope they're not just like psychic powers. I have a feeling they'll be something to do with like time travel and entropic fields and things like that. But we'll see. Who knows? And then where was I? Oh, Radamanth Nemesis. So as she walks up to the group, Rawl wants to save Ania. And Nemesis saying like, oh, I just want to talk to Ania. Everybody else will be totally fine. Don't even worry about it. And she's just got this like really sardonic, I don't know, for not being a character for very long, she has a ton of personality. I wouldn't be surprised if she comes back, but we'll see what that looks like eventually. I'm sure. So she walks towards them, and I don't remember exactly the chain of events, but she ends up in combat with the Shrike, which she was expecting, but normally she can sense when the Shrike does its like fast travel, slow travel thing, the time manipulation. And she didn't this time, and I don't remember why. I think it was because she was distracted. And so the Shrike basically stops her from decapitating Ania the very first time,
and they get into a battle, and we're going to talk more about that right after this quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Right before the break, we were talking about the battle that the Shrike and Radamanth Nemes get into. I think it's interesting that a lot of the big combat or fight scenes throughout this whole series have really centered on the Shrike. For it being kind of like, at this point, like a seemingly benign thing, I found it really interesting that, like, I wouldn't call it like the final thing, like the penultimate thing that happens is that Radamanth Nemes fights the Shrike. But apparently this particular day is one of the more difficult days that Endymion and Nia and Aebetic experienced. It's one that they definitely remember for a long time. I do think that I didn't quite phrase what Radamanth Nemes said earlier about Nia having powers correctly. It wasn't that Radamanth didn't know what they were. It was that Nia doesn't know what they are. And that's kind of like going to be part of her journey in the near future, if I had to guess. But when Radamanth Nemes starts fighting the Shrike, she has this thought of how the Shrike is a failed thing, which I think is interesting because to me, it always seemed as if the Shrike was just kind of like a neutral force. Supposedly, it was supposed to fly around the universe and kill humanity. I don't know, because it was supposed to fly its Tree of Thorns around the galaxy, while the people on it were like, dying but living eternally. Because Martin Silenus was on it at some point, but it is not like literally a tree. It's a it's like a virtual reality thing, I guess. Not entirely sure. Because when Braun Lamia finds Silenus, he's like hooked up to something. He's not actually on the tree. So, but I do think it's interesting that, like, in the first book, Kassad sees people on the tree and he sees Silenus on the tree. So, like, in some way, in some regard, that phenomena is real. So, but the reason that Nemes says that the Shrike is a failure is because it isn't able to draw out the human god. I think she calls it the human UI, which is I think is kind of funny that she would refer to it as that. But I guess whatever. God is kind of like a human user interface. So because the Shrike is a failure, she kind of exists. And the fight between the two of them is pretty interesting. We get to finally see what it looks like to the people who are, like, not traveling in fast or slow time. Because Radamanth Nemes her suit has the ability, or she has the ability to manipulate time immediately around her. as does the Shrike. That's how the Shrike can do things like make it seem like there's 1,000 Shrikes, like, because it's just manipulating time and like pausing in certain spots, like going so fast and doing certain numbers of things. It's like if a robot could time travel, which I think it's interesting that Radamanth Nemes feels unintimidated by the Shrike, because in my opinion, like from what the Shrike was described as being able to do when it was fighting Kassad, it seems like Nemes is either like just eons beyond Kassad ability-wise, or which wouldn't make sense for her to be like that good at fighting and also that bad at just finishing the job, because she totally does like the evil villain thing of like, I'm going to walk up slowly and I'm going to like relish this moment and then I'm going to actually fight the Shrike even though I really don't have to. Which is like kind of funny, but I don't know. Simmons does this thing where he writes these characters to be like almost perfect and then will like slip in like a flaw that doesn't make as much sense as I think it should. I think that, you know, as far as writing is concerned, the first book is absolutely the best. It's not that the other books aren't good or aren't worth reading. They're just not quite as good as the very first book is. And I think that is in part because it's getting kind of convoluted at this point as to like who's doing what and what was what thing and where and when and why. And the fact that now we've got this like random hitman from the Techno Corps feels a little bit like shoehorned. And then I don't know. I was expecting a little bit more as far as like philosophy is concerned and things like that. So I'm interested to see what the next book has in store for me, but we'll have to see where that goes. But back to the fight with Radamanth Nemes. She kind of seems like she is like defeated the Shrike a couple of times, and at some point she just starts trying to kill Ania rather than fight the Shrike. And the Shrike refuses to like, you know, stop fighting her. She even like tries to disembowel it, which I think is interesting that it supposedly has working innards in some regard. I also, like, I don't know, I feel like it has a way of healing its damage in some capacity. I don't know, the whole thing is really interesting. I am really hopeful that this architect that Ania is looking for is the one who built the Shrike. And that way we can figure out like what's up with it, because honestly the Shrike has been the most interesting character for the last 2 books. Maybe not the most interesting character. The most interesting thing outside of the characters and the story is the Shrike. And I am just fascinated to hear Dan Simmons' explanation of what exactly it is. So there's that. And then, gosh, I got a little sidetracked. So Radamanth Nemes is fighting the Shrike, and there's a couple other things that are happening simultaneously. Like I said, there's the description of Rawl and Endymion watching the Shrike and Nemes fight, which is pretty cool because it's the first time that we've kind of seen outside of that time travel thing what it is that, or how it is that the fighting looks. And he basically just describes it as 2 like blurs with a bunch of like, not supersonic, but like the air gets really hot and there's like little bursts of air and things like that. So you can feel the things happening around you because they're happening in fast time, but you're still perceiving time and moving through time in regular time, though Nemes refers to it as slow time. And the way that the fight is described is pretty cool, actually. There's like a time where the Shrike throws Nemes through the forest and she breaks a bunch of branches, and that she says that they're like suspended there, and then she moves to slow time and watches them drop, which I think is... It's funny that she calls fast time because things move in slow motion or freeze when she's in fast time. Kind of like that scene in X-Men when Quicksilver's running around during the explosion. But she and the Shrike duke it out pretty heavily until finally she just gets kind of tired of fighting it because she doesn't really want to take the time to actually kill it because she's got other things that she wants to accomplish. I don't know exactly what else those other things are, but one of them is obviously chopping off Ania's head. I don't know what you do after that. What are the other bounties the Technocore has, if she's a bounty hunter? But she slaps a little sticker on it that's called a Sphinx Trap, and the Sphinx Trap is activated via like a thought wave connection, and it launches the thing that you've strapped it onto 5 minutes into the future. The same way that the Sphinx throws people into the future, this Sphinx Trap throws its victim into the future by 5 minutes. So she slaps that on the Shrike, and then it's like kind of finally done. Ania and Endymion are, fighting to keep Abetic alive because he's almost bled out because his arm was chopped off. There's a few major arteries in there. Even though he's an android, I think at first I was like, oh, no big deal. And then I was like, oh, wait, really big deal. So definitely has not been good for Abetic. He's almost died. I mean, he doesn't die, but like his heart stops and his lungs stop. And they have to do CPR on him a couple times. So yeah, definitely is a rough thing for him, I suppose. So as Nemes comes back to Ania and Rawl, now she's really doing the what is it, like supervillain thing, and doing all like the slow walk up and like, I'm gonna get you. And as that's happening, Rawl hears on the comm unit on his wrist, which he had just randomly decided to put on when he was going into the water, or going through the portal, on gosh darn it, I can't remember the name of the planet that they were on previously. But as he's going through the Farcaster portal, he puts it on just randomly. And he hears a voice in it that says, go to the rocks. And there's a bunch of lava rocks nearby. So he runs towards the rocks, and Nemes teleports in front of him using fast time. And then a big giant laser from the sky comes down and shoots her, and it's like the laser is so hot that it burns off Rawl's eyebrows and burns a bunch of hair, and it's definitely like almost like one of the lasers that the ousters would have used to lance the planet. And Nemes melts down into the newly formed lava by the laser, and that's that. Yeah. So the fight ends kind of like forced. If I'm being honest, it kind of feels like a bit of Dan Simmons kind of had all these ideas for this person who was going to hunt Ania and was going to almost kill her, and was like, oh yeah, she'll be this cool and that cool, and she'll have these things, and she'll do these things, and it's going to be awesome. And then like he finally started to do it, and it's kind of like, oh, well, now I have to make it so that Ania doesn't die. Okay, how do I do that? This character's too good. It felt kind of forced, if I'm being honest. I appreciate the whole sequence of it and the build-up and all that, and I do think that like ultimately it doesn't take away from the book that much, but like really it felt kind of like a corny end to like a very serious story, is that like, oh, we shoot her with a laser from the sky. But, obviously the laser in the sky comes from somebody, so we're going to talk about who that is right after this last quick commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Okay, that's the last commercial break for today. So we have just a lot of ground to cover before the end of the book, or rather the end of the podcast, more like. So, if you remember correctly, last week when Desoya was preparing to jump, he had figured out that there was something up with Nemes and was not too happy about it, and decides to set some new parameters for something that we're not told exactly what it is. And what he does is up the timeline for resurrection by like 48 hours or more. I can't remember exactly. But basically, he made it so that he and Corporal Key and Father Gregorius, or General Gregorius? I don't remember. Sergeant Gregorius. There it is. Sergeant. Would all be revived within like 24 hours or something like that, or maybe even sooner than they normally would be, which is a big deal because he is suspicious that Nemes is like leaving the ship without telling anyone that she's leaving the ship. And so they would basically just be like on the hook to do whatever Nemes said. And then I think also he was probably worried for his life in some regard because, once Nemes had killed Ania, who knows what's going to happen to him after that, especially since really he kind of like ultimately had failed the mission. But he gets revived, and Corporal Key also is able to be revived, but Gregorius is not. And then when he is revived, he and Key go around trying to figure out how to get planet side, which is ultimately good that they couldn't. But apparently all of their combat suits, every single one, had a fault in them. I don't know how that happened. At first I thought it was Radamanth Nemes that did that, but she would have no reason to do that. The combat suits would allow them to like fly down to the planet without the dropship. So there's a chance that Nemes did that because she wanted to be the only one who could get down to the planet. But there's also a chance that they would have never checked the suits well enough to know that they had, because it was a very minor fault. So they end up stuck on the ship, Raphael, in orbit over the planet of God's Grove. And they pry open Nemes's little resurrection crush, and they find that she's not, or Kresh, and they find that she's not there, which is obviously, we know, unsurprising, but it's not, and it is kind of unsurprising to them. They were suspicious, but they weren't totally sure. So then they start sweeping the planet looking for life forms, and they get a lock on Nemes and Ania and everyone probably about like, I don't know, 5-10 minutes into the battle, if the battle even lasts that long. The battle lasts for like a chapter and a half, but the amount of time that actually passes is probably much shorter. And I think that part of Dan Simmons' approach to writing this book was to manipulate the perception that we as individuals have of time while the story is going on. So we'll think that like it's a lot more is happening than actually is happening. So, but a lot less is happening in the amount of time than we actually are like thinking about, if that makes sense. It's hard to describe. Basically, it takes us longer to read something than it takes for it to happen, and so we are in some way having this odd relationship with time because it's taking us longer to perceive of something that happened within a short period of time. And I think that that's part of what Simmons is going for when he's writing these books, because a lot of it is based on the idea of playing with time in some regard. So that's that. So Corporal Key and Father Captain Desoya sweep the planet. They find everybody, and they get a lock on Ania and Rawl and, kind of Abetic. He's on the ground nearby. And they watch a lot of the battle from the ship. And they bring their ship, the Raphael, down as far into the atmosphere as they possibly can. And then they start to divert a bunch of power from the rest of the ship into its tactical laser. And so like really they're looking to blast Radamanth Nemes, and Corporal Key's voice is the one that Endymion hears on the comm log. I guess what happens is he makes a tight beam that just goes down to the little wristwatch comm unit that that Rawl is wearing, and of course Rawl has no idea why or where the voice even comes from, but he runs to the rocks like he's instructed. Nemes, fast times in front of them, and then the Raphael shoots a laser at her, and she dies, question mark? If there's no confirmed body, there's no confirmed death, in my opinion. So we'll see if she's back again. At this point, we're getting a little comic booky for me. The first two books are such high science fiction that I am kind of like a little disappointed by the way that this book has gone. As I've mentioned several times before, if you just read the first book, you'd be fine. You don't need to read the other books. I know that it doesn't necessarily end anything, but I don't think that was really the point. But, it's your call, of course. So after Nemes is buried in lava because of a laser, which is a funny sentence for a 30-year-old man to say, Endymion, of course, wants to talk to the people who helped them. And so Endymion asks about, like, do you guys have an auto surgeon so we can help our friend? Because Abetic is basically dead, but not quite totally dead. He's like, better than Wesley and Princess Bride, but not as good as the Black Knight after he gets all his limbs chopped off. So, references. And, of course, Nemes made it so that they couldn't engage the autopilot. For some reason, she did a lot of preparations to make sure that she couldn't be interfered with by the people on the ship, even though she seemed fairly confident that they had no idea what she was doing. So I find that interesting that there's kind of like that inconsistency there. But the autopilot doesn't work on the ship, or the drop ship. So Corporal Key and DeSoya, they lead Endymion and Ania with Abetic on Endymion's back to the dropship, which has its own auto surgeon. And the whole time they're kind of just like talking, like, why the change of heart? What's up with this? And DeSoya and Key realize that they're kind of already screwed because they attacked the thing that was supposed to be like accomplishing a very specific mission, which was to kill Ania. And Endymion makes specific mention when they ask, why the church would send that thing, and he says, I hope it wasn't the church that sent that. If they did, the church is the monster. Pretty poignant point, pretty straightforward in your face point that I think we're going to see a lot more of in the future, especially considering that the church made statements to DeSoya that they were thinking about doing like a crusade against the ousters. I mean, like, if you look at human history, there's never been an instance of genocide against any particular, like, thing with even semi-cognizance. Like, we've all heard of, or a lot of us have heard of the documentary about the people who hunt dolphins. And, like, that in itself is viewed as, like, this terribly evil act. And dolphins don't even have close to the level of intelligence that a human does. They have some semblance of intelligence. It's just not, It's similar to, but not identical to. It's comparable, I guess would be the best way to phrase it. Especially if you ask Simmons. I'm sure he's very pro-dolphin. They were a big deal on Maui Covenant. The fact that I'm starting to remember these planet names is, I don't know if it's good or bad. But regardless, kind of all over the place here. The Crusades generally don't go well for anybody. The people involved on either side generally don't have a good time. So I imagine that is something that's going to need to be addressed in the near future, at least as much as possible. So, yeah, that's that. Let's see what else is there that's important to talk about at the end of the book. They get into the auto surgeon. Oh, this is one of those other parts in the book where I kind of felt like Simmons was forcing it or phoning it in a little bit. DeSoya and Key ultimately decide to go back to Pacham, which doesn't make any sense because they have the option to leave and go with Ania and everyone. But they say that they want to save Gregorius, but they could easily chart the ship to go back to Pacham and take Gregorius, and then they go travel with Ania. But they choose to go back because they're soldiers, but like a soldier also wouldn't have done what DeSoya did. So it just seems like there's kind of like these weird little inconsistencies in these characters that I don't like as much, because the Pilgrims all were like consistent. When Simmons said this is the way the person acted, you could guess how they were going to act and what they were going to do. And if it was outside of the norm for them, it was only because Simmons was describing the conflict that individual character was going through in making this new decision, and he showed the development to get there. Whereas DeSoya is kind of like out of nowhere all of a sudden is saying that, oh, hey, Endymion, I have your hawking mat, and it's like, I don't know, it feels just more like palatable of a resolution to the conflict that involved the Shrike this time in MS. And then they decide to give the dropship to Ania and everybody, which I don't know why they wouldn't. It's not like they can get the dropship back. There's no tractor beams in this story, so they're going to get to travel in a Pax dropship, which I'm sure will come up as a thing, which is cool. And then after that, we start to get a little bit more background on where it is, or where Rawl is while he's writing all of this stuff. He starts talking more about like this specific day, and then he starts talking about like a note that Ania wrote him. I should mention they travel through the Farcaster portal on the planet of God's Grove, and they end up on Earth, which is a big deal. And they see a building that supposedly has the no, they don't see a building. They start traveling around, and then they get a message from somebody on Old Earth to travel to this specific spot. And like, I think that's going to be the architect. I would guess it should be. I can't imagine with only one book left that Simmons is going to beat around the bush very much here. So we'll see. But they end up on Earth, and then Rawl starts to talk about other things that he remembers, and like how this particular catalog of their journey is like trying to bring Ania back to life, because Ania has died at this point in the future. And like, that's not surprising, of course. We don't really know how old he is or how old she was. We do know that like he basically says that he loved her in different ways at all times, especially like he loved her as a father when she was a child, and you know, as they grew older together and she became viable as a partner, they loved each other as partners and things like that. So I don't know. It seems a little bit like questionable that they met when she was 12, but I mean, it's pretty standard for science fiction stuff. Anakin Skywalker is 10 when he meets Padme, and she's 16, so she's 18 by the time he's 12. So, you know, there's definitely a thing. This might be a science fiction trope that we're all unaware of. So I'm not super thrilled about the way that Simmons is handling the fact that Endymion is writing this book sometime in the distant future. I don't really love that. It feels like another way to be like, ooh, look, this is a cool story. It's a story within a story. Like, I don't know, just not, I'm nonplussed about it. So I'm looking forward to see what the next book looks like. I'm excited about what that's going to be about. I am kind of excited to figure out like what happens with Ania in the future, and then like how it is that Simmons kind of continues to do some of like the really good manipulation of our perception of time as we're reading his books. So that's the end of Endymion. I don't have like a giant swelling soundtrack to congratulate us. We are going to get straight into The Rise of Endymion, which is the next book. We'll probably be doing like hopefully 5 chapters at a time. I want to get through this one a little bit faster than we've gotten through the other ones. So we'll see how that goes. But other than that, if you like the podcast, definitely leave a comment, leave a review, et cetera, et cetera. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, if we have one. I think we have one. So, yeah, thanks for listening, everybody, and have a good day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.